Moses is a figure revered in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, a man whose life and actions shaped the destiny of nations. His story begins in ancient Egypt, where he was born under a decree that condemned Hebrew male infants to death. Yet, through the divine intervention of God, Moses was spared, and his life set into motion a series of miraculous events that would culminate in the liberation of the Israelites from bondage. Moses' journey is not just a tale of leadership and divine miracles. It is a testament to the power of trust, faith, and obedience to God's will. From a humble birth in a time of peril to becoming the deliverer of a people, Moses' life would forever be marked by these core values. His rise from obscurity to greatness was not without its struggles. Raised as an Egyptian prince, Moses faced an internal conflict, torn between his royal life and his true Hebrew identity. After making a rash decision that led him into exile, Moses found himself in the wilderness, where God called him to return and lead his people out of slavery. What followed were moments of extraordinary leadership, where Moses confronted Pharaoh, endured the plagues, and led the Israelites across the Red Sea. Throughout these events, it was Moses' unwavering trust in God's plan and his willingness to obey, despite doubts and personal challenges, that transformed him into one of the most iconic figures in biblical history. Moses' story begins in a time of great peril for the Hebrew people. Pharaoh, fearing the growing number of Israelites in Egypt, decreed that all Hebrew male infants should be killed. Born into this dark period, Moses' life was threatened from the very start. His mother, in a desperate act of faith, placed him in a basket and sent him down the Nile River, trusting that God would watch over him. This small, seemingly insignificant act of courage would become a pivotal moment in history, as it marked the beginning of Moses' extraordinary journey, a journey that would change the course of the Israelites' fate. The basket was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, who, moved by compassion, adopted Moses as her own. Raised in the royal household, Moses enjoyed the privileges of Egyptian royalty, yet he never felt completely at home. His heart was divided as he grew increasingly aware of his true heritage as a Hebrew. This sense of alienation would shape his future and the decisions he would make. Moses was not just an Egyptian prince, he was a man caught between two worlds, and this internal conflict would eventually drive him to seek justice for his oppressed people. One day, while witnessing an Egyptian taskmaster ruthlessly beating a Hebrew slave, Moses' inner turmoil reached a boiling point. In an impulsive act of anger, he intervened, killing the Egyptian in an attempt to defend the Hebrew man. This rash decision forced Moses to flee for his life, and he sought refuge in the wilderness. There, away from the opulence of Egypt, Moses would begin his journey of transformation. What seemed like a failure was, in fact, God's way of preparing him for the great mission ahead. The years of exile would allow Moses to reflect, grow, and ultimately be shaped into the leader who would confront Pharaoh and lead the Israelites to freedom. Moses' time in exile marked a period of deep reflection and spiritual growth. In the wilderness of Midian, he became a humble shepherd, tending to the flocks of his father-in-law, Jethro. It was here, far from the royal courts of Egypt, that Moses would encounter God in a most extraordinary way. One day, as he led the flock to the far side of the desert, he saw a bush that was on fire but not burning up. Intrigued, he approached the burning bush, and to his astonishment, a voice called out to him from the flames. It was the voice of God calling Moses to a mission that would change the course of history. God's words were clear. Moses was to return to Egypt and lead the Israelites out of slavery. At first, Moses was reluctant. He questioned his ability to undertake such a monumental task, asking, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" He was aware of his past, of the wrong he had done in Egypt and the fear that had driven him into hiding. Moreover, Moses doubted his ability to speak eloquently, expressing concern about his lack of verbal skills. Yet God reassured him, promising that he would be with him every step of the way and that Moses would perform miraculous signs to prove his divine commission. Despite his doubts and hesitations, Moses ultimately obeyed God's call. This pivotal moment in Moses' life was a powerful demonstration of trust in God's plan. His hesitation was not a sign of weakness, but a reflection of his awareness of his own limitations. Yet it was precisely in his weakness that God's strength would be made manifest. God promised Moses not only divine presence, but also the necessary tools to carry out his mission. Moses' encounter with the burning bush was more than a divine revelation. It was the moment that solidified his role as God's chosen leader, preparing him to face Pharaoh and lead the Israelites toward freedom. Moses' return to Egypt marked the beginning of his courageous journey as the deliverer of the Israelites. When he arrived in Pharaoh's palace, he demanded the release of the Hebrew people with a simple yet powerful message: "Let my people go." However, Pharaoh, blinded by pride and stubbornness, refused to heed Moses' command. This rejection would set the stage for a series of divine interventions that would reveal God's power over Egypt and challenge Pharaoh's authority. Moses, knowing the task ahead would be daunting, was steadfast in his belief that God's will would ultimately prevail. God's response to Pharaoh's refusal was nothing short of extraordinary. Through Moses, God brought 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt. Each plague targeted a specific Egyptian god or aspect of their society, challenging not only Pharaoh's power but the very foundations of Egyptian worship. The first plague turned the Nile River into blood, a striking sign of God's dominion over life itself. Following this came locusts, frogs, gnats, and a darkness so thick it could be felt, each plague intensifying in severity. Yet, despite the suffering, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he refused to release the Israelites. The plagues culminated in the final and most devastating punishment: the death of every firstborn in Egypt. This was a moment of divine judgment, a direct response to Pharaoh's refusal to heed God's commands. However, God provided a way for the Israelites to be spared from this final plague. He instructed them to sacrifice a lamb and mark their doorposts with its blood, a sign that would cause the angel of death to pass over their homes. This event, known as the Passover, not only spared the lives of the Israelites but also established a lasting symbol of redemption and salvation for God's people. After the death of the firstborns, Pharaoh finally relented, and the Israelites were granted their freedom. However, his submission was short-lived. As the Israelites began their exodus, Pharaoh's heart once again hardened, and he pursued them with his army, leading to one of the most miraculous moments in Moses' leadership journey: the parting of the Red Sea. Moses, obedient to God's command, stretched out his hand over the sea, and the waters parted, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry ground. As Pharaoh's army pursued, the waters returned, drowning the Egyptian forces. This miraculous event not only marked the Israelites' physical liberation, but symbolized their spiritual release from bondage, reinforcing Moses' role as the divinely chosen leader of God's people. One of the most defining moments in Moses' leadership came when the Israelites found themselves trapped between the Red Sea and the advancing Egyptian army. As the Egyptian forces approached, panic spread through the Israelite camp. They were stranded, seemingly with no way out. In their fear, they turned on Moses, questioning why he had led them into such a perilous situation. Yet, in the face of this overwhelming crisis, Moses remained calm and resolute. He reassured the people, urging them not to fear, for God would deliver them. His faith in God's promise was unwavering, even in the midst of danger. Moses' confidence in God's power was not misplaced. God instructed Moses to raise his staff over the sea, and when he did, the waters parted, creating a dry path for the Israelites to cross. The miraculous nature of this event cannot be overstated. A vast body of water that had once stood as an insurmountable barrier was now a passageway to freedom. The Israelites walked across the seabed with walls of water on either side, trusting that God was leading them to safety. This moment was not only a demonstration of divine power, but also a testament to Moses' leadership, as he had the courage to follow God's instructions, even when the outcome seemed uncertain. As the Israelites reached the other side, the Egyptian army pursued them. But God commanded Moses to stretch out his hand once again. The waters returned, drowning the Egyptian chariots and soldiers who had been following in pursuit. The miraculous deliverance of the Israelites through the Red Sea marked the definitive break between them and the oppression they had endured in Egypt. It was a moment of salvation, not only physically but spiritually, as the Israelites witnessed the power and faithfulness of God in their lives. Moses, as their leader, was the instrument through which this miracle occurred, solidifying his role as God's chosen deliverer. The crossing of the Red Sea was a defining moment in the Israelites' journey, but it was also a profound lesson in trust and obedience. Moses had placed his complete trust in God's guidance, and in doing so, he led the Israelites to a victory that only divine intervention could have achieved. The event demonstrated that no matter how dire the circumstances, God's plan would always prevail. For Moses, this miraculous act was not just a triumph of leadership, but a powerful reminder that trust in God's power and purpose was the foundation of his leadership and the key to Israel's future. After the miraculous escape from Egypt, Moses led the Israelites to Mount Sinai, where God would establish a covenant with his people. The journey to the mountain was not without its challenges, but it was at Sinai that Moses received one of the most important revelations in the history of the Israelite people, the 10 Commandments. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses ascended the mountain, fasting and seeking God's guidance. During this time, God entrusted Moses with his laws, commandments that would govern not only the people's relationship with God, but also with one another. These laws became the foundation of the Israelites' moral and social code, a divine blueprint for holy living. When Moses returned to the camp, he found the people in a state of rebellion. While he had been on the mountain, the Israelites had grown impatient and had turned to idolatry. They had fashioned a golden calf, an idol to worship, turning away from the God who had delivered them. This act of unfaithfulness deeply grieved Moses, and in his anger he threw down the tablets containing God's laws, breaking them before the people. It was a dramatic moment that illustrated the consequences of disobedience and the seriousness with which God viewed their unfaithfulness. Moses, however, did not abandon the people. Instead, he interceded on their behalf, pleading with God to forgive their sins and not destroy them. God, in his mercy, instructed Moses to carve out 2 new tablets and return to the mountain to renew the covenant. This act of restoration was a reminder of God's grace and willingness to forgive, even in the face of disobedience. Moses' role as mediator between God and Israel was solidified in this moment. He was not only the leader of the people, but also their intercessor, standing in the gap between them and God. As he descended the mountain once again, this time with the new tablets in hand, Moses symbolized the reconciliation between a holy God and a rebellious people, bound together by the covenant that would define their identity. The giving of the 10 Commandments was a defining moment in Moses' leadership, not just because of the laws themselves, but because of the relationship that was being established between God and his people. Moses was the chosen mediator through which God revealed his will, and his obedience to God's commands ensured that the people would have a clear path forward. However, the incident with the golden calf also served as a sobering reminder that the journey of faith was not without challenges. It would require constant vigilance, trust in God's guidance, and a willingness to repent and return to Him when they strayed. Through these trials, Moses' leadership was not just about enforcing laws, but about guiding the people back to their covenant with God. The journey through the wilderness was perhaps the most testing period of Moses' leadership. After receiving the 10 Commandments, Moses led the Israelites for 40 years across the desert, a journey that was meant to take them to the Promised Land. However, their journey was far from smooth. The people, although freed from the harshness of Egyptian slavery, continually grumbled and complained about their circumstances. They faced hunger, thirst, and uncertainty, and many longed for the comforts of Egypt. It was during these difficult times that Moses had to rely on God's provision and guidance. He was constantly called upon to mediate between God and the Israelites, many of whom questioned his leadership and doubted God's promises. Despite the constant murmuring, God remained faithful. He provided manna from heaven to feed the Israelites and water from a rock when they were thirsty. However, the people's lack of trust in God was evident, and at times Moses struggled to manage their discontent. There were moments of failure, such as when Moses struck the rock in frustration instead of speaking to it as God had commanded, leading to a personal consequence. Moses was told that he would not enter the Promised Land. Yet, through these trials, Moses' trust in God's plan never wavered. He continued to lead the people, interceding on their behalf when they sinned and praying for God's mercy. Moses' leadership during these 40 years was characterized by his patience, humility, and unwavering faith in God's promises. While he was often tested by the people's disobedience, he maintained a deep connection with God, seeking his guidance in every decision. Though Moses himself would not enter the Promised Land, his role as a leader was crucial in preparing the Israelites for the future. His faithfulness in the wilderness set the stage for the eventual entry into Canaan under the leadership of Joshua. Moses' journey through the wilderness demonstrated that leadership was not about achieving immediate success, but about remaining faithful to God's calling, even in the face of hardship and doubt. Moses' legacy extends far beyond his role as a historical leader. It is deeply woven into the fabric of faith for millions of people around the world. His life is a profound testimony to the power of obedience, trust, and humility in the face of immense challenges. As the liberator of the Israelites, Moses exemplified the importance of faith in God's plan, no matter how daunting the circumstances. His leadership was not rooted in personal strength or glory, but in his willingness to surrender to God's will and guide his people according to divine direction. Through the trials and triumphs of his journey, Moses demonstrated that true leadership is about serving others, seeking divine guidance, and trusting in God's timing. Moreover, Moses' role as a mediator between God and his people remains a powerful symbol of reconciliation. His intercession for the Israelites, even in their moments of sin, reflected his deep love and commitment to God's covenant with his people. The laws he received on Mount Sinai formed the foundation of Israelite society and continue to influence religious and moral principles today. Moses' journey from his humble beginnings to his leadership in the wilderness is an enduring reminder that true greatness is achieved through faith, obedience, and trust in God's purpose. His legacy lives on, not just as a historical figure, but as a model of spiritual leadership and steadfast faith.